Alright guys, so this time around I decided to do a batch review of all the books that I read in the month of January. Doing one book review at a time, understand if that book isn't of interest to anybody, it's hit or miss. But at least if I do a batch review, if something in here catches your eye, you can at least get my 2 cents from it and get kind of an idea of what to expect from that book based on the reading list. So without further ado guys, let's jump right into it. So the first book that I started off 2021 with was, to be honest with you, the most frustrating, and that would be The Woman in the Dunes by Kobo. I've mentioned this in the past. I'm probably going to keep mentioning it because I want to get book recommendations based off of this guy, but Haruki Murakami for a long time was one of my favorite authors. Jumping into Murakami is almost like a psychedelic trip, and I had such a blast with that kind of surrealist, absurdist type of fiction. I've kind of been chasing that dragon ever since. Now, I kind of thought Haruki Murakami, Japanese writer, dig into some more Japanese literature. One of his books in particular, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, was described as a very Kafka-esque type of book, and I understand why they would say that, mostly because of the end of the world portion of the book. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, by the way, terrible title for a book. Don't do that. Now, in that portion of Murakami's book, the main character is kind of trapped in this psychological space where not a lot of things are explained, and he's kind of traveling around it, trying to understand himself, trying to understand exactly what's happening. And that is what this book kind of really struck me as when I read the back copy and when I read the author blurbs that were posted on the back as well. One of them said that it was a cross between Edgar Allan Poe and Franz Kafka. Awesome, let's jump in. So what happens in this book? Basically, an entomologist, somebody who studies insects, goes to the beach in hopes of discovering a new bug that he can name after himself. While he's there, he ends up being lured into and trapped in this giant village at the bottom of a sandpit, basically. And once he's there, I believe it's a village. Is it a village? Yeah, it's described as a village, but to be honest with you, none of the village is ever really explained. Once he falls down there, he spends all the time basically in one house with the woman in the dunes. And that was one of the things that frustrated me, is that it explains that there's a village, but there's not really much exploration into the village or anything else that might be going on there. It's basically him and this one woman in this one house, and they constantly have to clean the sand out of everything. Sand permeates every aspect of their life. It gets in their skin, in their hair, in their mouth, in their water. It dries out everything. It creates dry rot in the structures. So they're constantly having to dig it back. They're constantly having to sweep, to clean. And this person, I believe he's a teacher back in the city, and rightfully so. I mean, he wants to know when he can go back home, and nobody seems to be answering his questions. When he asks the woman why he's there, why the village is the way that it is, she kind of just retreats into this awkward silence that is very, very frustrating. And this is clearly an allegory, maybe for the lifestyle in Japan at the time, maybe for the lifestyle in Japan in general, maybe for kind of the mundane in and out of 9 to 5 quotidian life that can be very overbearing and very grating. And in fact, one of the reviews of this book that I read mentioned that reading it is very grating because you get the same sense of like the sand bearing down on you for all 250 pages. And I get that, but this could have easily been 100 pages less and still gotten the same thing across. While he's trapped in the sandpit, the protagonist gets pretty desperate, and then he basically kidnaps the woman in some way, even though she's already trapped. Nobody really cares, because if she's already trapped at the bottom of the pit, why would kidnapping her make any difference to these people? And still nothing is explained. You just get this kind of 250-page dissertation on the grating nature of the sand, despite all efforts for him to return to some form of his meaningful life, or what he would consider, I think, maybe a meaningful life, his regular life at least. The writing in this is strange, and there are some parts that are just really, really out there. I mean, at one point he equates either your boogers or your earwax to fine cheese and like other culinary things. The comparisons the appeal of this book is lost on me. It was just a very frustrating thing to try to get through, and to be honest with you, I stopped with about 50 pages left because I didn't think there was anything with the rest of the book that could redeem the previous 200 pages of the story. Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong and you've read this book, let me know in the comments, but this was not one that I would recommend. Alright guys, next book, slightly less frustrating, but still frustrating to me, and I'll explain why. I picked up this book, this one right here, for a few reasons. First off, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, I think is a wicked title. Some people hate these kind of titles, they're too much. This one is actually taken from a William Blake poem, which is kind of relevant to the story because they do translate a lot of Blake's poetry from Polish to English in the story. And speaking of Polish, this actually crosses off one of the reading goals that I had for 2021, which was to read an author from a country where I haven't read from yet. And this author, Olga, I'm going to try my best with this last name, Tokarczuk, I think. My wife is Polish. I should be better at this by now. She's a Polish writer, and it also said she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Big accolade. And then it also said that she won the Man Booker Prize, the international prize for this book as well. So lots of praise. Why not dive in, see what it's all about? Now, the jacket copy of this says that the story follows a reclusive Polish woman in the middle of the woods who loves animals more than people. Not unlike most of my wife's side of the family. I'm in. Then it also mentions that she's into astrology. Less in, and we'll get to that in a second. And then it says her neighbor Bigfoot dies, and it leads them into kind of a whodunit murder mystery. And I was like, okay, the main character is friends with Bigfoot. This is weird. I like weird stuff. Let's dive in. Let's see what it's about. Little did I know that it's not actually Bigfoot as in like any kind of Sasquatch. This woman just doesn't believe in people's given names, so she makes up names that suit them better and calls them by that. If that isn't somewhat telling about the main character's kind of perspective on things, it gets worse. So when it comes down to the astrology portion of this, we're talking capital A astrology here. We're talking Mercury in retrograde. We're talking about, Venus going through some aspect of Capricorn, whatever that means, which is fine. I mean, believe what you like, except that there are some very bizarre parallels that are drawn here that are way off base. Well, one of them is, for instance, she equates astrology with sociobiology and says that they're basically the same thing. The only difference between them is scope. One deals with the stars, the other one deals with atoms that are made from the stars. But in both instances, it's people that don't really know what is happening and using that to attribute traits of personality based on whether it's the stars or your atoms. And then she goes on to say that the only difference between the two is that she doesn't have any respect for sociobiology. Okay, except celestial bodies, hundreds of light years away, have no bearing on your life, whereas the atoms in your body constitute the molecules and the cells that directly impact your behavior and who you are. Like, this is scientifically verified. So already, again, you're getting into... I'm a pretty scientific-minded person. I also like artsy-fartsy weird stuff. But not when that artsy-fartsy weird stuff is like butting heads with the science based on complete whack job kind of ideas. And I really dislike that, and I found it incredibly grating. For instance, there's another portion where her and her neighbors are basically discussing why people end up the way that they are. And they're kind of laughing about it, and they're like, oh, well, maybe it's childhood trauma. Oh, maybe it's, society's expectations. Maybe it's the traits inherited from your parents. Maybe it's the expectations of school. Maybe it's the pressure from your peers. And then at the end of that whole dissertation, the main character wipes a tear from her eye in laughter, and she goes, no, it's Saturn. Your personality is not what you eat, it's not what you think, it's not how you were raised, not the society you're in, it's not any of these things. Saturn is why you are the way that you are. Okay. This is what I found incredibly grating about it, because so much of this book is basically long, diatribes about what she thinks about the world, and how everybody else has it wrong. So in this story, basically, after her neighbor Bigfoot dies, several other people start turning up dead, and then they start trying to figure out who has done it. And because this woman is very much like a big-time animal lover, which is great, so am I, she actually thinks that the animals are taking revenge on people because people are basically jerks. There's a lot of scathing indictments against hunters in this. Hunters are really painted as oafish people, and initially it's very frustrating, but then the hunters that are kind of featured in this book are oafish, and they're not the kind of ethical hunters that you would hope to have in that practice. But that's not immediately apparent, so a lot of the conclusions she draws early on, or the main character draws early on, are very grating. Like, I know a lot of hunters, and it's just not the way that it's explained in the book. The ones who are in the book are jerks, and that kind of plays into the end. And the end redeems this book a tiny bit. Did it redeem it enough for me to enjoy the book? not entirely. Now, this book wasn't a complete waste for me. I mean, I did enjoy a lot of the writing. I did enjoy the atmosphere and the mood of the book. It's just that I found the main character so insufferable, and I found that it was very heavy, like message fiction. I keep seeing this trend of people comparing various novels to Crime and Punishment, and they really have to stop doing this. One of the reviews said they both asked the question about who deserves to live and who deserves to die, except Crime and Punishment does that in a deep psychological investigation that balances internal turmoil with the societal kind of restrictions on that individual and how those two kind of play against each other, among other things. This one is basically a woman making arguments for animals based off of like astrology, and I can't get into it. If you can kind of detach yourself from that, there's also another theme in this book, and that is who deserves to be listened to, and I think that is a valid thing in this, because the fact that she's taken as a old mad woman, which it's mentioned several times in the book, kind of plays into the end and the consequences of this as well. So I mean, in that aspect, it accomplishes its task. I just don't think that it justifies the length of the book and the story I would want to read for this much time in order to do that, especially again with the topics that go on and on and on and on and on with this main character. So guys, the third book that I read this month, I actually listened to, and one of the coolest parts about this channel is already I'm starting to get book recommendations for other people. Now, in my review for Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, somebody recommended that I check out John Connolly's The Book of Lost Things. This book is kind of like a twist on fairy tales, and I'm not like a very big fairy tale kind of person. However, the way that they framed it and then the way that they accomplished this one was very, very good. So the story starts off with a young boy during World War II, and his mother is sick, and him and his mother used to read fairy tales together. That's how they would bond. His mother ends up passing away, and then his father remarries with another woman. They have a child. Obviously, this creates a lot of tension in the main character. His name is David. He's a 12-year-old boy, and he starts having these kind of epileptic episodes, and he starts seeing this strange figure start to creep into the real world. During this, some plane comes in and crashes in their backyard, and he kind of escapes into this second world. And while he's there, we kind of go through these episodic fairy tale steps where he meets a woodsman, and then once he passes through that woodsman, he goes to the next stage, and then he runs into dwarves, he runs into one after the other until it kind of rises to the climax. In terms of the fairy tales that happen, I thought it was really, really good. So one of the things that I enjoyed about this is that there are episodes in this fairy tale that are whimsical, but there are ones that are also very dark. One of the things that I remember researching when I learned about Japanese internment camps during World War II from interviews of people who were kids while they were in the camps, is that kids are very innocent to the injustices that are happening to them because they don't process it within the same context that adults do. And I think John Connolly does a really good job at balancing this and explaining kind of horrific acts, but through the innocent lens of a child in a way that you can tell what he's talking about. It doesn't have the sting, but it has the authenticity of how that would be processed from a young kid. Now again, I would have enjoyed this book regardless, but I enjoyed this a lot more because it's tied into the fact of familial loss, familial gain, familial conflict, and how the character grows and becomes a little bit closer to an adult in the act of shedding away the part of himself that was so deeply attached to his mom. Or maybe I shouldn't say shedding away, but growing from that, being able to let go of certain aspects of resentment, being able to grow into other aspects of himself. And obviously the kind of episodic stepwise process through all these fairy tales and all these challenges that is set before him are an integral part of his growth and his acceptance in his current conditions in real life. The way it's tied together at the end was very satisfying for me. Again, these conflicts where it's like mother, son, father, daughter kind of thing. I really, really love these kind of stories. So I thought this was really well done. I really enjoyed this. I thought the audiobook was really well done. Particularly the primary villain is known as the Crooked Man. And when the narrator was doing the voice for the Crooked Man, I thought it was excellent. So would definitely recommend this if any of this sounds up your alley. Definitely a fun story. Definitely the number one book of January, and I'm actually rereading this now because I want to do a dedicated review to this, and I want to make sure I do this book justice because this book is a very, very important book, and that would be the Gulag Archipelago. So this crosses off another goal that I have for 2021, which would be to finish a book that I did not get through in 2020. And I really wanted that to be the Gulag Archipelago. I think this is a very timely read, but I think it's also a very timeless read. The Gulag Archipelago is a scathing indictment of Stalinism and communism in Soviet Russia. It is a horrific tale of basically the Soviet work camps, how people would be arrested under the name of communism and any communist resistance, how they would be transported to these jails, what life was like in the gulags, exile, all sorts of things like this. And peppered in between there is basically the psychology that was involved in a lot of these heinous acts. I'm not going to get into too much detail in terms of what happened because I'm going to save that for the review. I think one of the biggest strengths of this book is spanning the gap between an ideology and the execution of that ideology. It's a horrific reality that something that can sound so logical in terms of equality for people can play out in such a horrific way. And it's very easy to slip into the allure of some of these ideologies, given that we haven't personally experienced the horrors of these. I've seen some egregious comparisons between a gulag and, let's say, a prison in North America. They're nothing alike. Now, I'm not saying that the way prisons are handled are good. That's a topic for another day. However, that is much different than being arrested for any reason at all and being thrown, for writing letters. If you were to write a letter to your friend against Prime Minister Trudeau or President Biden or anything like that, and they found that letter, you could be thrown into jail for 10 years. And in that jail, you could be subject to incredible horrors, people being shot around you. There are other books like this. If you don't want to actually pick this one up, there is a free book that you can find online with a little bit of digging called Islands of Hell by S.A. Malzagov. And he was somebody who actually escaped the Solovetsky Islands, colloquially known as Solovki, which is one of the most notorious gulags during the work camps. It's a shorter book. That one I think is only about 200 pages. Now, this book is actually an abridged version. The original version is 3 volumes long. I wasn't going to dig into all 3 volumes, and to be honest with you, even the abridgment is very hard to get through. It's one of those things where, like, it's obviously not a happy read, but I think it's a necessary read. I don't think you can have a conversation about the application of certain ideologies if you're not examining the consequences of what those really look like in real time in actual civilizations that have happened to real people. And when I say happened to real people, I don't even mean that long ago. There were people on my wife's side of the family members who were in the gulags. Like, it's not far removed. There are people who remember it. So that being said, I highly recommend this, but like, it's heavy, so fair warning. And those were all the books that I read in January. I only got through 4. I'm going to try to get through a few more in February. If you have read any of these, let me know what you think about them. If you guys have any other book recommendations, particularly if they're like Haruki Murakami, or if you have any other, if this is the jumping off point and you have any other recommendations that are in line with this, please let me know, because I'm always looking into that historical perspective. I think that's like an old guy thing. Like, the older you get, the more history centric you get. Stay tuned, guys. I got some cool videos coming up in the future. I'm going to be digging into some scientific research on the benefits of reading fiction, nonfiction, literary fiction, genre fiction, etc., etc. I have a strong science background, and I really miss using those resources to kind of enrich and educate. So hopefully those will be coming soon, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Os.